Hey everybody, welcome back to the Insights podcast presented by Vantage Pro. I am Duke. All the way on the other side of your screen is Mr. Van Maichele. Van, that's me back with you. And in the middle, our good friend Josh Maichele, the global, which just sounds cool, global applications director of the House of Worship. Man, I almost ran out of breath just saying your title. For L-Acoustics. Welcome. And Bass Pro Shops ambassador.
Yeah. Apparently, I realized that as I got on camera. I was like, oh, well, we're repping Bass Pro Shop today.
That's all right. It's good. Maybe you'll get a little extra side endorsement deal out of this.
Yeah, that would be nice. Just another fishing rod or something would be nice if you're listening.
Yeah. Well, Van and I were at Infocom a bit ago, and we got a chance to pop over to Resorts World and check out the new theater, which is a very large L-Acoustics L-Isa rig, and it was fun to get to check things out. And we thought, you know what, we haven't really talked about this immersive technology in a while, and really, I think it deserves some more conversation because it's probably one of the first real audio innovations in many, many years. Like audio just got like, let's make our drivers a little bit better or a little bit this or a little, like it's all been very small iterations of improvement over the years until this whole kind of immersive thing came out, 5-6 years ago. And boy, has it gained steam.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about kind of this L-Isa journey over the last number of years now, and kind of why we should care.
Yeah. So it has been a bit of a journey. I think we all had a conversation about this maybe 2017, 2018, somewhere around there on the podcast with you. And it's certainly come a long way. When I step back and I look at it from an L-Acoustic standpoint of where we've come over these years, I think one of the coolest things for me is that the highest adoption rate of L-Isa right now has been in House of Worship. I internally at L-Acoustics, they're constantly kind of wanting to know why, and what is the way we're explaining it in the House of Worship sector that's helping it be so successful there. And I think that's multifaceted. It's not just how we explain it. I think it's what it does for the experience. I was first exposed to L-Isa, I guess probably 9 or 10 years ago now, before it had ever really been publicly released. And I was a little skeptical at that point, admittedly, I was on staff with L-Acoustics. I was getting exposure to this new thing. And, for me then it even seemed a little gimmicky. I wasn't really sure, like, how is this going to translate? How in the world are we going to deploy this on scale? Because we were listening to it in these little, 10 meter by 10 meter rooms. And I was like, cool, there's a lot of really neat things you can do when you have, very limited amounts of space between speakers and things like that. But I was quite skeptical at that time of what does this really look like? And I would say for me, the turning point was in 2018, we did the very first L-Isa system in a House of Worship at Mount Perrin Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And, it was kind of stepping into the unknown a little bit. It was my first L-Isa system on scale. It was my first calibration of an L-Isa system. And we walked away from that. I walked away from that, totally getting it. And I think I've seen a lot of people have those moments with me. It's kind of cool that I've got to see that progression with many of our customers, both our integrators and our end users over the years now. And the tools have emerged, or have, I guess, they have matured over the time. We're on the version 2 processor. But I think to answer your question, why we should care is because the entire goal of what we're doing in church is to create connection. And I think you see that in room design, in this constant push for pastors having thrusts go farther and farther into the audience. And the point of that, I don't think that does anything for the audience, unfortunately, or for the congregants, right? In fact, you end up with 30% of the congregation looking at the back end of the pastor when they're preaching. And so, but what it's doing for the pastor is helping them feel connected to the people. And L-Isa is a different way of looking at how we can connect what's happening on stage with what's happening in the congregation. Um, and and all of this gets phrased under this, the buzzword now in the audio industry is immersive audio, and we're classified in that. And the first thing people start to think of is surrounds and overheads, right? That immersive means that you have speakers all around you. And I think when you look at it, and when I tell the story about L-Isa to people, I say that the immersive or the immersion comes from the fact that we have broken down the barrier between the congregation and the stage, and we can become more immersed in the word, whether that be from the standpoint of the pastor speaking or even the worship, because we expect to see things, we expect to hear things where we see them, right? And we've just become completely accustomed to the fact that I'm looking at pastor on stage and I hear him from over here. Um, and and so when you can break down that barrier, all of a sudden the technology disappears, and it's like, I guess that's amplified. It's louder than it should be, but my brain completely accepts that I'm now connecting what's happening. And when you take that barrier away, just like the reasons that we're doing, multicam shoots, and we are, lighting and all those kinds of things, we're trying to get rid of distractions to help people be able to have a genuine connection. And I think that's really where L-Isa shines, and I wholeheartedly believe that's why it's been so successful in house worship for us.
Hey, it's Van. I'm just going to jump in here for a quick second and ask you that if you like this content, please leave a thumbs up, please subscribe, click that notification bell, and share this out on the socials if you can. And one more thing, leave a comment. We absolutely read them and we will respond to them. All right, back to the podcast.
No, I would agree with that. Having been involved in a number of demos and one installation so far with another one coming this fall, that's one of the things that's always fun to watch, kind of that aha moment. Because like you think center of the room, like in a typical room, you've got left, right, and you're sitting in the center of the room looking at this guy talk on the center of the stage, or listening to a worship leader lead from the center of the stage, but you're hearing it from over here. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because the center of the room is like, oh, well, that's the best sound because you're getting stereo, but the imaging doesn't match what you see rarely. And so right. There's still this kind of funny disconnect there. And that is one of the crazy aha moments every time we do a demo or in the venue we've installed, is just all of a sudden you're not pushing things as hard. It's just everything kind of has its own place, has its own space. And it feels right. And most people can't tell you why. But once everything's kind of lined up, the visual matches the audio, all of a sudden it just feels better. It feels more engaged. And there's so many other side benefits too. Like one of the things that we always get into a conversation on is, so many audio guys these days, us old guys have figured out, okay, how do we get real sound out of a mono or a stereo system? And, the more inputs you throw in, the more we have to get creative with compressors and EQs just to try to carve out a little notch for something. And it's so fun being able to tell people, it's like, yeah, leave the compressor alone. If there's not space for the keys there, move the keys or move the guitar. Like you can actually move it. And so, like one of the big questions we always get is, yeah, but isn't it going to be a lot harder to mix on this hyper real environment with an L-Isa processor? And it's like, no, actually it's easier because you don't have to know all these weird back end tricks to try to carve space. You just move things around. Like the music guys listen to it and they get it right away. They go, oh, well, I just moved that over here and this over here, and all of a sudden it sounds amazing.
Right.
It's kind of us old guys that have to go, oh, I don't have to do all those things and I don't have to work as hard. I just have to think simple. It's like, man, I wish I could just move that. Cool, move it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you said at the demo at Resource World that really, struck a nerve with me, because I've been I've been an audio engineer my whole life, was you said something to the akin of, this takes away all of the things that we mitigate compromise with when we're mixing in a mono or stereo system. So we spent our whole lives mitigating compromise, and this takes that away. And that was, to me, it was like, that's exactly what it does. And that's the dream of you when you get into audio. This is what you hear in your head, but then once you turn the system on, you go, okay, well, what can I do with this? And
yeah, I think with the analogy I use a lot of times is I think I used this there, was that, we end up being kind of the sound police in terms of, or the gatekeepers of what's coming through. And in terms of the art of it, we were given a palette of browns and grays and two paintbrushes, or sometimes one. And you're trying to find definition between the browns and the grays when they're all mixing together with that paintbrush. And what L-Isa has done is given us a paintbrush for every color, and a almost limitless palette for us to paint a picture and not smear all of those colors together.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I love I love that it just opens things up, and that again, you get to get out of your head a little bit and think simpler when you're mixing, and it's always fun watching people like get behind the processor and look at the screen and go, oh, that's it? Like that's all it takes to do that? Right. Yep, it's not that hard.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned it before, but I've said a lot of times, I was on a call with some friends from Australia last week, and he's a high level power user, and he was struggling a little bit with losing his bus compression, that stuff that you were talking about, and I walked him through some ways to make that, what he wanted was that studio CD feel, the super compressed whole thing. I'm
Sure.
like, there are ways to do that, but do we really want to do that? Like, is the entire goal to make it sound exactly like the album? Because I don't think that the album is the best experience for corporate worship. It's great to listen to. That doesn't mean it's best for corporate worship. But when you go all the way back down to volunteers, what's the hardest thing for us to teach volunteers to do? It's to use dynamics well, to understand them and to use them, and even EQ for that matter, to listen for. And so if you can be in a world, I saw Fred Vogler one time showed the LA Phil, his session for L-Isa for the LA Phil, and he was using every single, it was 100 and some inputs. All he was using was high pass and low pass. And so if a volunteer can walk up to the console and all they have to do is pan a little high pass and maybe a little low mid attenuation, and their mix is going to be better on L-Isa because of the unmasking, to your point, Duke, of, okay, the keys and the guitars are masking each other. Well, let's move them off from each other. And all of a sudden they're not masking each other anymore. So we're not having to do all this multi-layer compression stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I think, one of the things that we try to teach, Josh, me, you tuned the last system when I was a TD, you tuned that system. Mm-hmm. And it was mono, and I got a lot of grief from certain people about why we did that room in mono, but I still stick to my guns because we had volunteers mixing. There's a lot of things happening. I wanted consistency, not the musicians to feel awesome about their mix in the headphones, kind of a thing, and so you either have that or you have L-Isa. I actually am not a stereo fan, but I am an L-Isa fan. So I'm like, okay, if I could do that, then I would go away from mono. And, I know that's like a big controversy, and I'm probably in the minority these days of mono and stereo. But what I want to do is I want it to sound like if I was standing on stage with the band, and I could, and I was part of it, and I was part of the band. And I think that's ultimately what L-Isa does is, it makes the audience feel like it's an intimate, like you were saying at the beginning with the thrust stage, it makes the audience feel like there's no bad seat anymore.
Right.
And so, I think that's the big thing. And you didn't talk about at all, not one time did you say, okay, first we're going to go in and EQ all the tracks.
Right.
There was none of that. You were like, hey, we're just going to turn the tracks up. And I do think, though, that it is more important now, and we talk about this all the time with our customers when we're trying to teach them stuff, is it's really important to get the source pure at the source.
always.
So important, and because with all that unmasking, there's not a lot of place to hide. I mean, the tracks I was playing for you guys, I'm very, very lucky to have access to those. And I think most of the musicians on stage probably have at least one Grammy. But the key there, besides the fact that they were good players, was the drums were, I had to do almost no work on the drums because they were tuned perfectly. And the guitar tone and the intonation was all really good. And so you're absolutely right. All of a sudden we can expose that, and that can be a real challenge for people. I found that with L-Acoustic speakers in general. We have lost demos because we were too transparent, which is so counterintuitive, right? I mean, if you want more distortion, you can always add another Waves plugin to do that. If the distortion exists in the PA, you can't take that out.
I remember bringing some guys out from Chicago to Westlake Village. Well, it wasn't Westlake Village at that point; it was further out, but to the headquarters to do a speaker demo. And as we were back in the car driving back to the airport, the worship pastor's just in the back, super quiet. Tech guy can't stop talking, but the worship pastor's in the back, and he finally goes, "So is our rig really going to sound that good, that transparent?" And I said, "Yes, it is." He goes, "Man, we're gonna have to rehearse a lot more."
Yes. I was just going to say that I never forget Devin Bumstead, a church not too far. It's in Thousand Oaks, and when we did, and it was a very last of the WIFO systems, yeah.
Yep.
And I'm standing there, and he walks out because I'm mixing, and he walks out, and I walked down to him, and I said, "So what do you think?" He said, "Well, first of all, this is way better than I could have ever imagined that it would be, even when we did the demo. And second of all, we are really going to have to step our game up."
Yeah.
He goes, "Because I thought we sounded good, and we need to do some work."
Yeah. So turning directions just a little bit, because I think one of the most common questions that we get when we start having the conversation about kind of this more spatial speaker systems is, "Oh my gosh, that's just going to be horrendously expensive."
Mm-hmm.
It costs more for sure, but can you speak a little bit to kind of how you normally respond to that?
So I've done a lot of cost analysis, and I have a presentation I give our providers, and in fact, there is a sweet spot where a lot of times L-Isa can be cheaper, and in those scenarios, or let's just say cost lateral, because ultimately, a great example was what I used in one of my presentations. It was a 2,500 seat room. The left-right system designed was a K3 left-right system. We were able to design an A15 L-Isa system that was about, I want to say, 12% less expensive. Now there's some integration costs on top of that, so I would venture to say it was probably closer to cost lateral when all was said and done. But the reason that we can do that is, one of the reasons that manufacturers build two-way active speakers, three-way active speakers, is we want to ask each component to do less. And if we can ask each component to do less, we have higher dynamic range, we have lower intermodulation. Think about that when you look at L-Isa on the scale that we're doing. And the reason I can take a K3 system that's an active two-way system and go to a passive two-way speaker system like A15 is I'm asking each loudspeaker to do less. And so it's the sum of all things, right? So if there are 5 arrays hanging over the stage, we're looking to have shared coverage between all 5 arrays. And so what we get, because they're decorrelated sources, is a perfect summation of all 5 arrays at any point in the listening area. So if I match performance metrics between a K3 system and an A15 system, it turns out in that specific instance, it was basically cost lateral. But they gain all of the benefits of L-Isa. And one of the benefits maybe you wouldn't automatically think about is sight lines. And actually, in that instance, what drove that system was more the sightline win than it was the technology, because with a product like A15, we have a focus in a wide box, so a 10-degree vertical box and a 30-degree vertical box. And so we can fit vertical coverage in a much smaller area with A15. And because it doesn't need to get as loud as that big hang of 10K3, well, it turns out now we don't have these arrays dipping into the video screens because, of course, everybody has to have a bigger video screen, right? So the bigger the LED wall, the better. And then, of course, nobody wants, lighting or audio to be dipping into those very expensive LED walls they just bought. In case in point, Mount Perrin, actually our first two of the first three L-Isa systems that went in churches, it was actually the win of the sight lines that won it for us, not the technology. And I think that's a big testament to that for us. It's a big testament to the fact that it's helping audio cohabitate with video and achieve all of those goals that we're trying to do ultimately, to have the visuals and not have the audio system impeding on those visuals.
And I will say this, we've had 3 very real L-Isa conversations with churches. One's been installed, one is installing in September, and one is just waiting on funding at this point. All 3 of them started with the conversation being about sightlines more than anything about the technology. And then when we went and started looking at things going, well, I mean, 2 of these rooms were fairly sizable rooms with plenty of trim height. But for whatever reason, they're going, yeah, but we really don't want a 12 to 15 foot line array hanging here. What options do we have? And we're like, well, we can basically take that vertical and go more horizontal, keep things higher to the ceiling. And by the way, you get all these really other cool benefits like, spatial mixing and all this other stuff. And they go, oh, but that's going to cost a lot more, right? And that we did a lot of that same analysis. We're like, well, if we look at 2 in one of those cases, it was Cara arrays versus A15 L-Isa concept. I think the total price delta was like $30,000 in a many $100,000 system for a 3,000 seat auditorium. And when they went, wait, for an extra $30,000 we get 6 foot arrays versus 12 foot arrays, and we get all the spatial mixing. Like,
Yeah. Right.
Like, oh, okay, that sounds good. Let's do that.
Well, and just to dip into another culture a little bit, I think we were talking about theater. Because theater has a sightline issue a lot of times too, because there are a lot of theaters where the proscenium is really high, but the roof of the house is really low to the proscenium. And they don't want that stuff dipping into the proscenium. They want the proscenium arch to be shown and to be, especially because a lot of these productions now are using the proscenium. Like I think of like Wicked, where the whole proscenium is part of the set, and so they don't want the speakers to be hanging down into that, And so, and the thing that I hate when I go to theater, most are just using 2 stereo big towers on each side. Right. And so that's all they're using because it's easiest to road in. But I can see this being, because it's smaller arrays, easier to fly, even if you're touring. And you're going to get 10 times better sound, especially with theater, because of it's going to place people where they should be on the stage. And that's a way better experience, for theater.
Yeah. I mean, we have a great example of that in New York right now on Broadway with The Outsiders. It's L2D, which was an insane amount of power and vertical coverage in a very small package, so they're getting the K2 experience, but it's 5 hangs of L2D, and it just won a Tony. The sound designer won a Tony for sound design. So that's very exciting. And you're absolutely right. It allowed them the freedom to, represent what's happening on stage accurately without impeding on the visuals of what they have going on there.
And we do a lot of churches where, everything is value engineered in the building. So how high is the ceiling? I remember way back when I worked at a church out here in Southern California called Mariners. And when we were building that building, there was literally $1 million is another 8 feet on the building, like for every 8 feet of this 3,000 seat auditorium. It's like $1 million to build another 8 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
So there was literally probably 20 conversations about, okay, do we really need, oddly enough, it was about catwalks. It all ended up about
Right.
catwalks, but this is, but this is like a big thing. And the trim height of the arrays in that room were a huge, source of consternation through the entire build process,
Mm-hmm.
And so to take that out and really have compact arrays, but still have amazing sound, actually better sound, that's a huge, to me, that's like, that's a giant cost saving win for ultimately for the whole project,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are you seeing kind of as the future? Just forecasting a little bit, and further adoption in the church world in particular. Like, what do you see as the future of this? Like, what's kind of the next step of, or is it just simply more people get it?
I think one thing that I've said a lot, and I think it's important to say, is that L-Isa is not the end all be all answer for sound, right? I think as a sound designer, it's another tool I have in my tool bag now. There inevitably will be mono systems, there will be stereo systems, there will be distributed mono systems, and there will be L-Isa systems. There are some rooms that, based on the limitations of our technology, just don't fit L-Isa, and that's okay. Um, I think that's something to keep in mind when you're building a new building, or you're doing a significant remodel or something to that effect. Is maybe you don't have to push the stage all the way out into the room now, and maybe you don't have to have this insane 180 or 240 degree fan shape to create engagement. So I think a little bit of the future there is that as people start building new buildings and redesigning their buildings, that we can look at it through a different lens. In terms of where it's headed with L-Acoustics, most of or I think, as you guys have seen as a provider for us, the new products that we're releasing have this in mind. The LA 7.16i opened up a huge amount of the L-Isa market for us now because of the individual box resolution, the 8 ohm impedance, that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, that's opened up that. And then you look at evolutions like having L2 now, which gives you that K2 sound, the K2 SPL, but in a much smaller package, which is allowing these larger churches. We've had 3 quite large churches that you guys will see coming on in the next year, that are L2D L-Isa, because they wanted K2 left right, and for their scale of the rooms, an A15 system just wasn't enough, and so now L2 opened that up. And so as new product offerings come out from L-Acoustics, they're always going to have the lens. Like, we wholeheartedly believe that L-Isa is the future. It's here. It's being adopted very well, but we see it continually growing and evolving. And more and more, I'm also seeing a move now to considering things like the surrounds or the overheads, to increase, I guess, engagement, and that feel. I think as we've moved into this kind of post-COVID culture, where all of us understand that that our attendance numbers are not what they were pre-COVID, and so it becomes more and more challenging when you have these larger rooms that are only 50% full to create the same level of engagement that we had before. There's something to sitting in a worship service when everybody around you is worshiping together, and that feel. I think all of us who are listening to this podcast and on it have all had that experience. But when the room is 40 or 50% full, it gets a little more challenging to do that. And so adding the surrounds and being able to create kind of that feeling of more people around you engaging, really, again, helps break down that nervousness barrier. It can be challenging to be the only person singing in your mind, right? And the only person worshiping. But if you can feel that a little more. And so So more and more I'm seeing a move now to that, which obviously there is a cost to that, right? That, when we start looking at, we're no longer going to be price lateral or a small bit more expensive to do that. But if there is a ministry purpose for it, we find ways to justify all kinds of other things that are maybe more expensive than the simple route in AVL in the churches. And so if there's a ministry purpose for it, it's no longer just whiz bang. Obviously you can do all the whiz bang, right? You can move things around and you can do all that, but does that really have a purpose in the church for us? I don't know. Maybe for a sermon series or a cool thing, but in terms of worship, to me, that's just a distraction. So the surrounds and overheads are more there to create better engagement and a better room feel.
I think there can be some win in it, especially when you start kind of thinking about the concept of variable acoustics. Being able to when during a worship portion, or especially if it's a venue where you're transitioning between more traditional worship styles and more contemporary styles, being able to add more kind of reverberance and life into the venue as if it was a more traditional venue, and then being able to tighten it up for the message so that the message is clear and you're not struggling to understand everything that's spoken. I do think there's some value there for people who have kind of a wide dynamic range of their services. We're almost out of time, but one other thing I do want to point on for a minute, because I think this is one of the things that's super fascinating to me, is this whole spatial audio system thing is very scalable. And you've said it without saying it. When you're talking about going from, you can design the system around the L2, the big boxes, to the big K series line arrays, to the A series, like you can design an L-Isa system with little 5-inch speakers. Like, I think it's super fascinating how scalable this thing really is.
It is, and a good use case example of that is what you guys heard when I mixed at Resorts World was actually mixed here in my studio. And so here in my studio, I have 7 X4Is and an SB10i. And I had a friend of mine come listen to the mix because I wanted, some critique before I went and presented this in front of hundreds of people. And he walked out of here saying, I have never sat in front of a system in a studio like that felt like a large PA. He was absolutely blown away. And I mixed it all here. I lit it up, right? So, I mean, this is the biggest disparity or comparison you can have, which is 7 X4Is and an SB10 to 98 K2 and 16 KS28s and 24 KS21s. And I changed nothing. I didn't change a thing in the EQ, nothing in the level. And that's a testament to, the kind of consistency that L-Acoustics has, both tonally and in our calibrations. How I calibrated this room is the same as how Resorts World was calibrated. But that's a great example of that scale. And so, yeah, you can have L-Isa systems. I think BYU has some L-Isa systems that are Sivas or just X12s. And so it is scalable, almost beyond what you could fathom. I have yet to find a church too big to put L-Isa in, and so and really there's no too small either. Obviously, when we get to very, very large and very, very small, it comes at more of a premium. But again, to both of your points, maybe that premium is justifiable for the end goal or the end result.
Yeah, I think if line arrays are potentially in the conversation, there are potentially some cost lateral, as you put it, opportunities with L-Isa. When you're talking in the kind of single box range, that's where you have to want it. I mean, my dream scenario at my church would be an L-Isa rig with 12 XTs or 12 X's. And I would love that. Is it ever going to happen? Probably not. But yeah. That would be my dream. But we seat 400 people. So right. There would have to be a high value from leadership, and that's not going to be a high value for us. But for some, it is. Even in a smaller venue, having that clarity and that kind of spatial approach is going to be a high value. And I think the fact that it is that scalable is pretty cool.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think one of the things that we haven't talked about, but you kind of alluded to at the beginning, is for a lot of churches, we put these big rigs in, and they're loud. There's a lot of SPL happening, and one of the things I
Mhm.
thought was very cool about the Elisa system is that you get a great experience, and honestly, it's probably not as loud as it doesn't because it doesn't have to be because you're not having to push
Yeah.
everything so far to everything, so you get more of a sonic purity out of it that because I mean there is you do sacrifice a lot when you get stuff up above 95 100 dB. You're starting to sacrifice a lot of the sonic sweetness of things, and Elisa takes that back, and
Yeah, I think I've found that to have a similar experience, you can mix 3 to 4 dB quieter. Um, I have also found that because you have less intermodulation and distortion and things like that, you can accidentally mix much louder than you were too, right? So
yeah,
there's a
for
converse
sure.
thing there because it doesn't hurt. Um, but yeah, certainly, we found by and large that on Sunday to Sunday services, we run sound check and everybody wants to give it the beans. But really, when we get into a Sunday service, I've found that people are mixing a bit quieter because they have the intelligibility. They're not trying to
Yeah,
um, overcome, let's say, limitations of things like comb filters that just don't exist in the Elisa world because of the decorrelation. And when you get rid of that, the intelligibility is higher. We've kind of created the best of a mono system and the best of a stereo system. Um,
yeah,
in
for
a
sure.
mono system, to your point, Van, you want as little overlap as possible between the loudspeakers so that you're not fighting that comb filter and you get good intelligibility, but it can be limiting in terms of creativity. In a stereo system, there is a spatialized point, but it's very, very small. And we've taken that spatialized zone and taken it from 15% of the audience to 80% of the audience, maybe. So,
Yeah. Well,
Well,
and
the
and
experience.
and and what you said earlier, one of the reasons I think Elisa works is because, and I mean, I had a conversation last night at an event. Like, well, you're always an L-Acoustics fanboy, and I'm like, here's why. L-Acoustics is one of the only companies where all of their stuff in a certain
Mhm.
frequency range is voiced exactly the same. And like it's an actual selling point of L-Acoustics. I remember Scott drilling it into us at the first
mm-hmm,
meetings. Hey, all of this stuff, we make all this stuff sound the same so it can all interact with each other. You can have K2s in the front, you can have A10s in the back, you can do all this stuff, and the whole audio plane sounds consistent in that range. And it's one of the things that I just love about L-Acoustics the most is, I mean, other people make great loudspeakers, but
yeah.
very few companies are focused on we want all of our stuff to be voiced the same so you can use it in every different scenario. And that really is how Elisa shines
Yeah.
because it doesn't really matter what boxes you use, they all voice the same. So
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons that it works.
Yeah. Well, any parting thoughts for us, Josh? For somebody who might be considering the spatial awesomeness of things?
I guess I would encourage anybody who's considering this to experience it, and there's something to be said for experiencing it live. I
Mhm.
think you guys have experienced this too. I can give you a really great experience in a demo, um, but when you walk into a room where it's happening on stage live and you hear it, and you forget that there's a PA there, that's what will change. I think that's what will help you really conceptualize it. And so, we have lots of churches out there. But have them, I would encourage anybody who's considering this, go take a visit, um, and experience that connection for yourself. I think that will make your mind up really quickly.
And I will agree with that. We have done demos with folks with no band on stage. We have done demos on even just a rehearsal, not even a Sunday, just during a
Mm-hmm.
rehearsal. And the demo, when there's actual band up on stage, blows your mind because now you make the connection of what you hear and what you see. Whereas if it's a demo without a band on stage, you can hear it, but it still just doesn't, like, it's not all there yet. You're still just
Mm-hmm.
you almost get it, but not quite.
Yep.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
Elisa is really a show don't tell kind of a demo, and
Yep.
once people experience that, you know, I mean, I've been to a ton of demos, but the best ones are when you have a band on stage and you actually can hear what it sounds like in the real world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure. Well, very cool. Well, we've got a number of show notes we'll put in. In fact, we'll probably throw in our link for Nazareth Lutheran up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, that we did a while ago, and then later on this fall, if you're in the Kansas City area or anywhere near here, because we're like in the middle of everything, we'll have another venue here at the end of September with L-Isa, and take Josh's advice. Go listen somewhere. Hopefully with a good band and somebody who knows how to mix it. But I have found that even people who are just decent still sound pretty good. So, but we'll drop in show notes, including Josh's contact email. If you want to sign him up for all of the spam, you can do that. Or
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
You can ask him good questions. But Josh, thanks for being with us. We just are so appreciative of what you guys are doing and telling the story. And for all of you who are listening, I appreciate you checking us out and listening. Make sure you like and subscribe, all the things on the YouTube. That makes Van happy. He does a little dance every time somebody subscribes. And we should video.
I'm the one that actually looks at all the analytics, so it does make
You are. We should videotape a little dance, and then every time somebody subscribes, they can email you dancing.
I don't think anybody wants to see that.
Okay. Well, if you want to see that, make sure you drop a note here, or if you have any questions, let us know. But thanks for checking us out and listening to the Insights podcast.